violent non-state actors. And I think we managed to get just the right lineup of speakers to do that reflection. So let me introduce them. And there's just no way that I can do justice to any of their resumes in the time that we have. So I have to do it briefly. First up is Yannick Veilleux-Lepage. He's an assistant professor of terrorism and political violence at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. And he's done lots of research into many topics related to terrorism and extremism, including far-right international networks, online propaganda, and the terrorist adoption of new techniques. And his latest book, which I, by the way, highly recommend to all of you, is How Terror Evolves: The Emergence and Spread of Terrorist Techniques. And today he will tell us more about how the survey was conducted and what came out of it. Then we have a duo made up of David Hoffman and Barbara Molas. David Hoffman is an associate professor of sociology at the University of New Brunswick, and he did research on all sorts of violent non-state actors, political, religious, criminal, all of it. And Barbara Molas is a postdoctoral fellow also at the University of New Brunswick, and she's leading expert on the far right during COVID. And together they will speak about whether and how violent non-state actors are adapting to the changing security environment. Our third speaker is Leah West. She's an assistant professor of international affairs at the Norman Peterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. And what is particularly interesting for us here today is that she's also one of the editors of the edited volume that is called Stress Tested: The COVID-19 Pandemic and Canadian National Security. So that means that she's in a perfect position to speak today on whether the pandemic has hampered states in their ability to counter and respond to violent non-state actors. And then last but certainly not least is my dear colleague Evian Leidig, and she's a research fellow in the current and emerging threat pillars at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism. She's done a lot of research into online far-right extremism, and she's the editor of the most recent Career book, which is called The Radical Right During Crisis, and it looks at far-right activity during the pandemic. So with this background, she's a great fit for the topic that she's going to be talking about, which concerns the question whether the dissemination of extremist content and propaganda during a pandemic warrants any security concerns. Okay, now a few housekeeping notes to keep the session running smoothly. Each speaker will have 50 minutes, and there will be a Q&A session afterwards, meaning after all the panelists have all given their presentations. If you have a question, please feel free to submit it at any time during the briefing using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And perhaps you could begin your question by mentioning who you are addressing the question to. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can, and we'll do it at the end, but maybe if there are smaller questions for clarification, we can do them quickly between the presentations, but I'll be the judge of that. Also, please note that a recording of this briefing will be made available to all registered participants on the ICCT YouTube channel. And finally, please help us improve future live briefings by completing the survey that will pop up on your screen when you leave this briefing. But that's enough for me. Yannick, over to you. Tell us about the survey.
All right, so just the 1 minute panic of getting the shared screen going. Hopefully I do have it working. Yes, can somebody just nod at me? Barbara? Yes, wonderful. All right, so thank you for joining us. The inspiration behind the work that I'm going to present very, very briefly, because I do want to give as much time for the panelists to talk about the fantastic work that they've been doing on this topic. But the inspiration that comes behind this really has to do with the fact that COVID changed everything. It's a paradigm shifting event. It changed the nature of work. It changed the nature of social welfare. It's changed the nature of family structures. And in doing so, we believe that it also is a changing event in the nature of how non-state actors behave. And with this in mind, as we saw a proliferation of research and articles and think tank pieces and webinars coming out on the topic, we, essentially being a small team at Leiden, myself, Dr. Tommy Van Steen, and one of our fantastic graduate student, Maria Helena Kosova, essentially started wondering about, okay, what are the expert assumptions that underpin the way terrorism scholars are thinking about the long-lasting impact of COVID on non-state actors? And essentially, we sought to do three things. First of all, we did a systematic literature review to see what are kind of some of the guiding assumptions in the literature. And then from there, we decided to start systematically collating opinions of scholars on a variety of topics that we saw as like being the debates that were emerging in the existing literature in order to see if there's any kind of consensus. And this exercise in itself isn't just an exercise on knowledge production. We thought it had some fairly important implications. So we know through existing research that terrorism scholars actually, and national security scholars kind of more broadly, have an important role in shifting and formulating national policy decisions and public debate. So therefore, understanding how they think about the impact of COVID on non-state actors is very important, because these assumptions and these beliefs and debates might shape a domestic and international counterterrorism policy. And then the second aspect of this was this desire to create a type of like intellectual time capsule. So we've got a lot of research that often tries to see how big paradigm shifting events affect the way that we think about terrorism. But this research is usually quite retroactive. So we saw in the aftermath of 9/11, a lot of people started doing research trying to understand how did 9/11 change the way people think about terrorism and political violence. But we thought, because the nature of COVID as kind of a long-lasting crisis, it would actually give us the chance to collect these opinions during the crisis itself. And then perhaps in the future, we can do a similar comparison in 5 years, 10 years or so, and see how these opinions have shifted. So really trying to capture what scholars were thinking during the crisis was very attractive to us, and we thought it would have important societal relevance. So in all the literature that we surveyed, we saw essentially three major themes emerging. So the first one had to do with whether or not the COVID-19 pandemic would mitigate or contain the ability of non-state actors to plan or conduct attacks. The second thing that we saw debating in the literature had to do with whether or not these non-state actors would try to take advantage of the confusion, the fear, and the uncertainty that was caused by the pandemic, and would in many ways adapt to the new changing environment. We know that terrorists are very adaptive agents. We were also very interested in understanding whether the pandemic would provide or would create important security gaps on how states responded to violent non-state actors as priorities were shifting. And then lastly, we were also interested in understanding what the impact of perhaps like increased dissemination of extremist content and propaganda during the pandemic would lead to, whether this is kind of a pressing security issue that we needed to look at. So these are the topics that we saw emerging in most of the body of literature and that we sought to investigate. So in order to do so, we went through all the issues of three main journals: Terrorism, Political Violence, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, and Perspective on Terrorism. So three of the leading journal on terrorism. And with a group of four fantastic interns, we found the email address of everybody who had published, or mostly everybody who had published in these three journals since 1997. We found just short of 1,500 emails. And then we sent this survey, which had about 30 questions on these assumptions, on the impact of non-state actors to these various scholars. In total, we got about 142 valid response. On the screen, you can see kind of a quick breakdown of where these people came from and just their large demographic information. But we see the majority of them have come from academia. some individuals in think tank or in government, and the majority of respondents were based both in North America and Europe. So that's some of kind of the demographic things that came out of this survey. And I should mention that this survey took place between March and May of this year. So what I want to do quickly in this presentation is, as I said, we had about 30 questions. I just want to kind of draw attention to 5 of the findings that I think were particularly surprising or particularly interesting, and perhaps may create or lead to neat discussions later on, but also may link to what our panelists are going to talk about. So the first one is the fact that the majority of respondents identified far-right terrorism as the biggest threat posed in North America and Europe during the pandemic. So this to us was quite interesting, and it did so by quite a large percentage. So about 50% of respondents identified violent right-wing organized group, and whereas or violence or jihadi Salafist groups were only identified as the primary threat by about 8.5%. So right-wing terrorism seems to be the issue du jour, if you will, in the mind of those who were polled. The second aspect that we thought was really interesting is, despite the fact that there was a lot of literature and a lot of concern in the media at the beginning of the crisis about whether or not terrorists would seek to weaponize COVID, or whether or not the kind of large disruption that we saw as a result of COVID would serve to inspire terrorists to engage in a biological agent attack, this remains something that very few terrorism scholars appear to be worried about. The majority of the threat seems to continue to be perceived as coming from conventional attacks against the general public or conventional attacks against security officials. So I think this is quite interesting, particularly given that we've got this huge body of literature at the beginning of the crisis, which is kind of pointing to this as a real potential issue. But amongst terrorism experts, it doesn't seem to hold a great deal of credence. The next aspect that we thought was very interesting as well is how non-states attempt to engage in pro-social activity has been perceived as essentially the main way that these non-state actors and the Sahel region would try to leverage the crisis. So while we posited a bunch of scenarios, some ranging from the very, very violent, using this time or using the insecurity to try to break out prisoners held in camps, engaging in and plotting attacks against the West, or kind of learning new skills and testing new technologies. The majority of respondents essentially told us, or the largest category of respondents essentially told us that, according to them, non-state actors would really try to leverage the pandemic by engaging in these pro-social activities that would allow them to gain larger constituency at the local level. And similarly, we have a huge amount of response. Nearly 3/4 of our respondents essentially told us that these pro-social activities may allow these non-state actors to engage in more successful recruitment. So I think this is something that's quite interesting, particularly the fact that the pro-social aspects of terrorist groups is often relegated to kind of to the back burner of terrorism research. So that to us was one of our findings that I thought would be interesting to highlight for our audience today. And then one of the aspects as well, and we've got quite a significant amount of data on the role of online propaganda, but really what was interesting is this kind of notion that far-right extremists would really try to center their propaganda on a narrative that is against COVID measures. So essentially the notion that measures that have been brought forward in order to restrict the flow of COVID are anti-liberty and are means by which the state is trying to curtail the rights of citizens. And we thought that was quite interesting as a whole, because we do know that there's several aspects of far-right propaganda, and I'm sure Evian will talk to us about this, but that the particular like anti-COVID measures seems to be, according to many scholars, what will be the most successful aspect of far-right propaganda and whatnot. And then also a large amount of our respondents were concerned about the impact of misinformation and conspiracy theories within far-right propaganda. And then the last point that I think was quite interesting is one, we saw a large amount of respondents essentially telling us that they are worried that or a large part of the respondents told us that they believed that the pandemic would lead to a decline in international counterterrorism efforts in the MENA region and the Sahel region. And most of these people who believe that counterterrorism efforts in those regions are going to be declining as a result of the pandemic identified essentially fracturing of international collaboration as the root cause of this. But what was interesting as well is that amongst those, there's about a 50-50% split as to whether or not this would have a detrimental security impact for North America and Europe. So half of these respondents told us that this declining counterterrorism efforts in the Sahel and MENA region would increase the threat of attacks against North America and Europe, and the other half said that it wouldn't have that impact. We also saw that there's this general belief that government funding towards like CVE and PVE programs in North America and Europe would diminish after the pandemic. So there would be a reorientation in government spending, which would be detrimental to CVE and PVE efforts. So this essentially is just a very, very brief overview of the paper we're currently working on. There's a couple of takeaways that I think are quite neat here. So the fact is that we saw the far-right terror in North America and Europe, and the proliferation of far-right propaganda is generally deemed to pose a larger threat than Islamic extremism, according to our respondent. That violent non-state actors in the MENA and Sahel region seem to have leveraged this crisis through like pro-social activities rather than violence. And lastly, that this threat of bioweapon might continue to be exaggerated or is relatively low compared to other attacks. But also what's quite interesting is that our survey has shown us that there's still large lack of consensus amongst the terrorism expert that we surveyed. And it really reaffirms the importance of doing this like empirically based studies about the impact of the pandemic on non-state actors. And this is why I'm so excited about the lineup that we have today, because we have a group of panelists who are going to be able to talk to us about the actual empirically grounded work that they've done on the impacts of this pandemic. So this hopefully sets the scene. Field of terrorism studies remains very divided on some issues, but there are some interesting and some unexpected consensus that we saw in there. And then I look forward to hear more about each panelist's individual's work and how it's going to deal and address with these themes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Yannick. I think you're right in saying that it's very good to kind of like map the various opinions that are out there, and yeah, I'm not surprised to see that there's a lot of discussion among terrorism experts, but I'm also glad to hear that we're also in agreement about something. So that gives us indeed, I think, an interesting basis to move on to the next speaker, or perhaps I should say the next duo of speakers, because David or I don't know which one of you wants to go first, but can I give you the floor to Barbara, I think. Can I give Barbara the floor to give us their views on the ways violent non-state actors have been adapting to this whole new situation that we're all in?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we will be sharing a presentation that will focus on that issue specifically. So if I'm gonna try and share my screen, if that's okay. so that we can start the presentation. If I could get a sign that it's working. Yeah, thanks. Yes, that's going to be the focus of our presentation. And in terms of contents, David first will intervene to talk about our larger project, which is focused on COVID-19 and the escalation towards politically motivated extremist violence in Canada. He'll talk about the focus and methodology that we hope to start working very soon. And then for my part of the presentation, I'll talk about a couple of case studies that we think illustrate the type of strategies that the far-right has been following during COVID-19 to adapt to the changing security environment online. And for that, we'll focus on Reddit. So David, if you would like to go first.
Thanks, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank both of our hosts, the ICCT and TSAS, for providing us a chance to speak a little bit about our research. And what I'm doing here really is, I suppose, the advertisement or the public awareness side of things, and explaining a little bit about how Barbara and I came to begin working together and what we plan on doing over the next 2 years. So I have the immense privilege and pleasure to work with Dr. Barbara Molas, and she is a postdoc fellow who is working with me at the University of New Brunswick, that is part of a Public Safety Canada and TSAS initiative to look at the nexus and the extremist nexus between right-wing extremism, wow, I'm being redundant, and COVID-19 in Canada. We have a 2-year project slated, and this is some of the preliminary research that Barbara conducted over the summer that is building up to the first step of our 2-year project. And essentially what we're starting with, and what's displayed on the slide there, we are beginning with a larger overview on using open sources, one of the bane of existences of all terrorism scholars, as I'm sure you know. But we are looking at the trees, sorry, the forest, not the trees, gathering a bit of the literature. We are putting together data sets of actors, groups, and events over the past 4 to 5 years to get a pulse on what has happened. As Yannick said, everything changed with COVID, and we're trying to at least get a national context or national understanding with the fingers crossed hopeful intent of conducting cross-comparative and cross-national research in the future. Next, we are going to work with our partners in what we call the Swedish research team. This Public Safety Canada grant is part of an overall collaboration with a team of researchers in Sweden to conduct said cross-comparative and cross-national research. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into case studies, potentially interviews as well, and essentially add a certain element of mixed methods, a little bit more of a holistic approach to some of the large end data sets we're putting together in step 1. And this will, in collaboration with our partners in Sweden, will hopefully give us some insights that not only for the Canadian context, but for the Swedish context as well, and hopefully when we extend our research with our partners there. And step 3 are the deliverables. So we're hoping, with an asterisk, obviously, since we're in the middle of the pandemic, things are still changing, but we're hoping to not only provide positive research impetus for our colleagues and other interested parties and partners in government. We hope to put together some tangible, practical materials that can be used for CVE, potentially for our partners in government and in security, and so on. Barbara, can I get the next slide, please? So I've alluded to some of the methodology already, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But the first phase, as I mentioned, Barbara and I are looking at the trees and not the forest. And there's a small but emergent literature and actually many a good chunk of the panelists here are major contributors to said literature, but we are going to gather that together, and we're going to extend that a little bit further to look at and cross-fertilize core ideas from literature on conspiracy theories, millenarian groups, apocalyptical groups, violence, anti-vax, those types of things. And we're going to try and harmonize it into something concrete and usable by both ourselves and our colleagues. As I mentioned, phase 2, or the end of phase 1, will be the creation of this large database data set within the Canadian context. We'll be collaborating with our colleagues in Sweden as well on the variables and on the code book to give this a little bit of an international flavor, in the sense that if we want to replicate this research, it can't just be Canadian-centric variables. So in conjunction with our colleagues there, we will hopefully create something that can lead to a useful tool across those national contexts. And then, as I mentioned, case studies and profiles. We're going to interview police, security officials, anti-vaxxers, former members, right-wing adherents who have fallen into the COVID rabbit hole, and so on and so forth. Anyone we can get our hands on. So I might as well make that appeal. If you happen to know someone in Canada who has fallen down this rabbit hole, please get in touch with us. We'd like to talk to them. You got to seize these opportunities when they come up, right? So we are focused on Canada across Canadian scope, but we are paying a particular attention to the hotbeds of COVID extremism: BC, Alberta, Ontario, and the Maritimes, since I've completed a large research project here earlier this year that we're going to tap into that data and identify people. So we will add the prairies in Quebec as the project evolves. We know Quebec in particular is a hotbed for some of these extremist ideologies relating to COVID, and it's on our radar. And as I mentioned, our intent is to replicate this in Sweden and beyond. With that, I'll pass it to my colleague, Dr. Molas.
Thanks, David. All right, so addressing the specific question for this presentation regarding how right-wing extremism has adapted to changes in online security environment, as we promised before, we're going to focus on Reddit as a case study and try to illustrate those adaptations. So Reddit hasn't been, or the opposite, has been quite criticized since the very beginning for being sort of like a platform where violent racism thrives, and where the far right usually quite easily can spread misinformation, radical extremism, and enhance recruitment. And it was not until this year that Reddit's terms of service were actually updated to specifically say that hate speech would be banned and accounts would be banned if that was based on identity or what they call vulnerability. So we wanted to really see whether or not changes in the behavior of the far right online have adapted to that last update, and whether they've done so effectively or successfully. And we've observed two strategies or two changes. So one of them is outlinking. Outlinking existed before COVID, and it means using hyperlinks for extremist and radicalizing purposes. And which it means is essentially, instead of sharing a text on the main feed of a platform, which can be identified by algorithms, users would use hyperlinks or short links to lead users to weaker pages, what we call weaker pages, or sites with less protective measures, in order to share the extremist material in those sites. So outside of the main platforms or mainstream platforms that we would, like Reddit, for example. But in the context of COVID-19, the use of outlinking really increased to circumvent precisely the updated terms of service, because the terms of service, as I mentioned, now we're actually using for keywords that reflected hate speech. So outlinking really was a way to avoid those algorithms to find that hate speech online. So in order to really see the nature of outlinking in the context of COVID-19 and as an adaptation to the updated terms of service, we looked at 4 fairly large groups on Reddit. The language that all these groups share is English, and we've identified the users to be mostly located in North America and especially Canada. So in terms of the qualitative analysis, we identified this group as sharing a white supremacist view of society and the wish for an ethno state, which is something that the alt-right has been promoting specifically in North America. They would talk about eugenics a lot and how to improve what they call race. And so they would talk about whiteness too. They would challenge the ideas of liberalism and democracy and accuse democracy of being unreliable and of protecting sort of equality that doesn't actually exist. They do think that inequality and even an authoritarian form of government is more natural and it's desirable. And within that sort of rhetoric, we would often see, anti-Asian, anti-Black, and anti-Jewish speech very often. And I'll explain how this happened, given that obviously the algorithms would look for those type of speech to be banned. And finally, homophobic language was something that was pretty common across these groups, particularly attacks against the LGBTQI+ community. But what's interesting is the quantitative analysis. So we found out that up to 100% of the most popular posts in these groups used outlinking to share extremist content. So this qualitative discourse that we're talking about was not playing on the main feed, but you actually had to access the hyperlinks. But up to 100% of the most popular posts use hyperlinks in order to spread that type of information. And when I talk about the most popular posts, I'm talking about the main 50 posts that created the highest amount of engagement by users. That's usually how Reddit calculates that. And even more interestingly, we found out that up to 55% of those outlinks to extremist material were facilitated by Reddit itself. Not by Reddit main feed, but by Reddit's own image and video hosting service. Other prominent outlying sites or third-party sites would include hosting services, new media sites, and right-wing and radical sites. And to that type of movement, to users using Outlink or outlinking to lead other members of these groups to weaker sites like hosting services or new media sites, etc., Reddit reacted to this and learned to locate and remove outlinks relating to third-party hosted harmful content. But it did not react in terms of, applying the terms of service that it's been applying on the main feed to its main hosting service sites for image and video specifically. So in there, the security and safety algorithms don't seem to apply. As a consequence, Reddit is responsible for up to 56% of outlinking activity that facilitates the spread of hate speech and recruitment online. So that's one strategy that we've seen it's being more frequently used and in a very successful way to recruit more and more people. So these groups that I mentioned before are actually growing, and outlinking is one of the main strategies that is being used for that to happen. The second strategy we wanted to talk about is about irony and humor. And most of us here have read tons, I will assume, about how effective memes, for example, have been to the far right in the last 5 years or so. And there's been a lot of literature about it. And it is because, humor has been very effective with the far right because it's a way of creating an emotional response. And also it's used to show a sort of ambiguity to disclaim a real commitment to extremist ideas that the users are sharing. And irony has increased as well during COVID-19, but in a very different way. And I saw this happen while studying outlinking in one of the case studies that I mentioned before. That's the Reddit's group, Behold the Master Race. What I noticed is that 50% of their most popular posts included fascist pictures or images of fascist leaders, especially fascist and Nazi leaders from the 1930s. So historical images, we could say. But all these images did not look like memes. They looked like historical images, and they were framed by an explanation or like a contextual sort of like sentence. But that sentence was never a sentence that would lead an observer to think that they actually admire these people. But to me, that was strange because obviously these were images shared by a group supported white supremacy and a fascist form of government. So I was like, well, what's the trick here, right? And I started accessing these images, and through the images to what I call the photo chat, so the conversations happening after users decided to click on the photo within Reddit. And so these are some of the images. So you see what I'm talking about when I say that it looks like they're making fun of this fascist leader. So for example, for Hitler, this is an image of him dressed in folkloric clothes. And he would say, or he said, that this was not a manly way of dressing, that he was not proud of this picture at all. And he didn't want the picture to be spread or shared by anyone. And so this group is sharing this picture and making fun of the sense of manliness that the Nazis would talk about because of this picture. And on the right, we have it's a video, not a picture, but this is Mussolini, and it's a speech that he's giving in Rome in the 30s. And the description includes, he looks like a clown. So it looks like they're making fun of him, right? A couple more pictures. Just on the left, we see a sheep dressed in Wehrmacht uniform, and they're talking about, the Aryan race, but they're being ironic. They're saying most of you are Aryan race, and then they put the photo of the sheep, right? And then the last picture is Joseph Goebbels, who was the Minister of Propaganda under the Nazi regime. And there were a lot of pictures of him among the 50 most popular posts on that group on Reddit. And most of the pictures portrayed or depicted him as you can see here, the attack Jew lover, or like someone who looked very, with very strange physical features, and that didn't look at all like the ideal Aryan race that the members of this group would talk about. But once you get into the photo chat rooms, what we discover is that the irony that is framing these historical images becomes a conversation about fascism. So for example, for the picture of Hitler dressed in folkloric Bavarian clothes, there was a conversation about, well, so what's the manliness that he was talking about, that he wanted to, live up to? And then they talk about the sense of manliness in Nazi Germany. And then what's the Nazi dress code? What is that Hitler would have worn normally to appear more like, in a sense, following the larger Nazi code? In the video where we can see Mussolini giving a speech, the conversation would turn into a conversation about the effectivity of populist discourse and fascist rhetorical style, and how to best appeal audiences that are desperate for it, they're talking for a savior, and what is that works and doesn't work. Then with regarding the sheep image that we've seen, they would talk about eugenics and whiteness. So as I mentioned before, they would talk about, the Aryan race and the sheep representing the Aryan specimen. But then in the conversation, they would say, well, this is what we would look like if we hadn't, protected the white race in a way that it keeps improving. So they would talk about eugenics in the 30s, how the Nazis thought about eugenics and the effectivity of them in the Nazi regime, and how eugenics could be applied today. And so they also would talk about whiteness. And finally, every time there was a photo of Goebbels, they would talk about propaganda and how, if you repeat a lie many times, then it becomes truth. And they would talk about what type of techniques the Nazis used to increase recruitment. So what I realized is that what seemed to be just, as it happens with the memes, what seems to be a joke or like fascists making fun of fascists, it actually becomes a room to teach about fascism. And within those chats, you could also see outlinking happening. You would see links that would lead users further to weaker sites, to maybe, Mein Kampf and literature like this that you wouldn't be able to access easily in the mainstream platforms. And irony was still there, as we've seen often in memes, especially on Twitter. So if a user was or seemed to describe one of these fascist leaders in a very, in a way that it looked like the person was praising that leader, then that would be followed by LOL, haha, or like a smiley face. So essentially, after the algorithmic war started against the meme culture, it looks like the far right or online decided to use irony in different ways. And one of them was using historical fascist imaginary framed by what will look like an anti-fascist rhetoric before you access these photo rooms. And so the result is that right-wing extremism has taken the extremist debate past the images to freely share information on fascism, racist ideals, extremist speeches, and Nazi organizational and even clothing structure. So in summary, we do believe that outlinking and the use of humor have become effective far-right strategies for misinformation and recruitment, and have increased in the context of COVID-19 and as a response to improved safety online environment. So in terms of recommendations, and that's our last slide, Reddit's image and video hosting services need to be monitored for hateful content, we think. References to past and present symbols of hate and persecution need to also be carefully monitored for the prevention of radicalization, and also to design reliable alternatives for safely access to extremist material, especially for those interested in history. Predicting challenges rather than simply reacting to existing ones will allow us not to be permanently one step behind, and it may help improve detection and intervention mechanisms. So one of the ways maybe we could consider doing that is identifying the loose networks across platforms that happen through outlinking. So following outlinking really can be a way to predict the movement of information migration, and that can help us predict the sort of groups and networks and new recruitment strategies that can develop. And finally, in order for transparency policies to work together with safety policies, transparency, we think, on the user's part is necessary too. So an example to do this would be generating new requirements about users providing their full legal names when creating a social account. And that would be good not only for Reddit, but also for Facebook, for example. And that would be all from us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you very much, David. I think it's interesting to have like sort of a more empirical view about like how the way things really have an empirical view of the way that things are developing in that online milieu. And like what always strikes me is how like, and I think you pointed it out in a very interesting way, is how multi-layered it all is, right? Because someone says something and then it's ironic and then it's not. Right, so it's getting hard to make sense of, and David, I also appreciate your appeal to for people to come up with people who went down the rabbit hole. I think you'd be surprised how many people are able to help you out with that. Almost 2 years into the pandemic. Okay, so. I'm slightly misinformed you about the schedule that we're sticking to. I said that we were going to have Leah West now, but we're going to instead of that move on to Evian Leidig, and then after that we'll give Leah the floor. So Evian, can I invite you to share with us your insights about this, the dissemination of online propaganda and the security concerns that warrants?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I think the slide is up. If there's any technical issues, please do let me know. So what I'm presenting today is based upon ongoing research that we have been conducting as part of the Current and Emerging Threats program at ICCT. And what I'm presenting today is related specifically to far-right extremist propaganda during COVID-19. So this is just a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on jihadism, for example, so I won't be touching upon that in today's presentation. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to start off by identifying some of the key trends that we've picked up on within the last 18 months or so, which is that the first point, and I think this is actually an interesting contrast to Yannick's presentation earlier concerning the survey results, but we've detected that COVID-19 has accelerated the shift to a post-organizational far-right scene. That is, individuals that are working outside of traditional organizations and more towards fluid networks. with traditional groups declining and more online networks emerging, as well as the emergence of citizen journalists. And this sort of ties into some adjacent content related to sort of doing your own research, which is a common slogan within the Q movement, but also trying to find the facts and the truth. So we can discuss some of this during the Q&A, but I think this is an interesting contrast to the survey results that Yannick presented concerning how violent right-wing extremist groups are deemed to be the greatest threat during the COVID era. And I do want to note that, of course, this trend has been occurring within the last few years, but COVID-19 has really amplified that trend. The second point concerning a key trend is that COVID-19 has offered what could be called a perfect storm for the coalescing of different ideologies and movements. This includes everything from the extreme right to libertarian groups and also conspiratorial groups. Q, of course, is the most obvious example, but we can look towards other types of conspiratorial networks that have emerged during this time. And then finally, and I want to take my opportunity here to say that COVID-19 has allowed far-right state actors, and I know that today's live briefing is going to focus on non-state actors, but I do believe it's very important to stress the importance of far-right state actors during this time to exercise overreach and the erosion of democracy. Most notably, an example would be Orban in Hungary in terms of constitutional overreach. Okay, next slide. Now, the first point that I want to address is Farright exploitation of the pandemic. When we think about the far right today in relation to the pandemic, I do, adhere on the side that the far right has been exploiting pre-existing grievances that have arisen during the pandemic as a means of advancing its agenda and ideology. And we very clearly have seen this within the last 18 months. Some examples that I've linked here are from the US and Germany, left and right. In terms of the coalescing of far-right protest movements against COVID-19 restrictions, against anti-mask wearing, anti-vaccination campaigns, etc. We also have, of course, noticed this in other contexts, such as Australia and the UK. Next slide, please. There is also, and I think this is quite frequently overlooked, the importance of gendered far-right responses to the pandemic. So what I've shared here on the screen, and I've anonymized these individuals, is ongoing research that I have been conducting on women within the far right, and in particular, how their gendered responses to the far right is framed, or sorry, how their gendered responses to the pandemic is framed. So the first three photos that you see there are taken from Instagram stories of a far right female influencer. The photo on the far left says, I have posted a link to a video made by David Cullen on the ways in which the Kufr jab could affect female and male fertility. And the Kufr jab here is referring to the COVID vaccine. And Kufr, for those who don't know, is a term that originated on 4chan to refer to an individual who has become infected with the coronavirus and subsequently coughs or coughs from eating bat soup in Wuhan, China. So a very racist image of someone who's been infected with the coronavirus. Now it's sort of transcended its racist origins to refer to anybody who has been infected with the coronavirus as someone who's a kufr. So speaking of that cross-platform posting earlier that Barbara mentioned with Reddit, we also see this across several different platforms. And this post also alludes to how the coronavirus vaccination affects both female and male fertility, and that's quite important to indicate that it's both women and men and their fertility that's being affected by the coronavirus or the vaccine. As this influencer writes, this is all a plan to reduce the population via widespread sterilization. So this conspiratorial notion that this is all a planned act with the coronavirus vaccine. As she says here, Bill Gates is spearheading the push for mandatory vaccination. So this post is very much indicative of the types of disinformation that's being spread by these far-right individuals, tying into other aspects of conspiratorial information that I discussed earlier with the coalescing of ideologies. And interestingly, when I was doing my research, I noticed how many of these far-right individuals are purposely altering or manipulating the spelling that they use in these posts. As you can see, their vaccination is deliberately manipulated there. And the reason for that is to circumvent platform regulations in terms of the flag violations for putting out this content. During the pandemic, Instagram put out an automatic banner on posts which users could click that would redirect them to the World Health Organization's official statistics about the coronavirus. And so these far-right individuals online know that very well. And so they're thinking about ways to circumvent those types of flagging of their material. And then the photos there in the middle are also from the same far-right female activist. And this is also something I had noticed in doing my research, was also the rise in prepper and survivalist mentality during the pandemic. So those two photos there, you can see that this is the types of food ingredients that she keeps in her family's cupboard for her prepper pantry items, as she describes it. And similarly, the types of heirloom seeds that she's bought and for her emergency seed vault. And this is certainly something that became quite escalated, I would say, particularly after the January 6th Capitol insurrection, in which this accelerationist mode had really taken root. And then finally, the photo on the far right shows a female far-right activist there out in a protest against the vaccination campaigns. And you can see she's also holding her baby there in that photo. And so all of these examples I want to point out to because of the very gendered responses that they elicit in response to the pandemic. And I should note that in that photo on the far right, in the comments section, you can see that she had received a comment, "Why didn't you tell me about this protest?" And then she says in response, "It was in our Telegram, that's how I found out." So again, we're seeing the types of cross-platform posting that's happening as a means of communication and mobilization for these far-right actors for their offline activities. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I just want to take a brief moment to also point to the fact that far-right state actors and their response to the pandemic, even though I know today's briefing is focused on non-state actors. One very good example that I would like to discuss is Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who repeatedly described COVID-19 as a, quote, mild flu that could be treated with a malarial drug, the one that you see him holding there. Throughout the pandemic, Bolsonaro had systematically downplayed the risks and blocked centrally coordinated responses during the pandemic. And it was recently found during a televised parliamentary investigative committee hearing that his administration had committed crimes against life by preventing the purchasing of vaccines and treatment options. So I just wanted to point to this example to also indicate that, you know, when the far right is in power, when it's in government electorally, these are also the types of sort of anti-science responses that we can find within these circles. Okay, next slide, please. So if there's one takeaway I would like to have for you today, it's the myth that far-right responses to COVID-19 are all the same. So there is this standard narrative, mostly from examples emerging from within the US and Germany, that the far right has mobilized against COVID-19 measures such as lockdowns, mask wearing, vaccination campaigns, etc. Now, this is no doubt the case in many instances, but it's not the full picture. And if you are curious, we do have a piece I've co-authored with Tin for ICCT looking at the diversity of far-right responses to COVID-19 and painting a much more nuanced picture. And we note that what we think about when it comes to the standard narrative is largely the case in Europe and North America. However, even in these regions, responses can be mixed even amongst various far-right groups and organizations. Next slide, please. We call this ambivalent responses at our piece. So one example is the Dutch and Flemish far-right group Voorpost. And the Dutch branch had, at least during the earlier days of the pandemic, called, for instance, social distancing within its demonstrations. And they were very proud of adhering to these social distancing regulations. And for a very long period of time, Voorpost had no criticism of the Dutch government's COVID-19 measures, which is quite striking because you would assume that wouldn't be the case. I should note that more recently, Voorpost has shifted to becoming more vocal against some of the latest COVID-19 measures, which is an interesting shift in terms of understanding their responses and can really show that there's quite a lot of nuance even amongst or within these far-right organizations. Similarly, we see within the Dutch branch of Pegida that they are somewhat critical of restrictions, but that criticism is largely directed towards the inconsistency and application of these restrictions. And so this does add an element of nuance to the discussion. Next slide, please. Another example stems from the Nordic resistance movement, which is an extreme right neo-Nazi organization in the Nordic countries. As Simon Lindberg, the Swedish branch leader, wrote at the beginning of the pandemic, "I won't spread the belief that the establishment and media are exaggerating the risks in an attempt to scare the people into submission, or the idea that they're covering up and toning down the risks in order to avoid causing panic." Now, this is very similar rhetoric to what we see with other far-right organizations in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But later on, the Nordic resistance movement postponed a rally that was supposed to be held. And Lindberg had stated the reason for that is we have a big responsibility to our members and sympathizers and their families. It would be extremely irresponsible of us if we held our demonstration and simultaneously contaminated hundreds of nationalist-minded people with the virus. So this is a very interesting change in terms of actually recognizing the very real potential risks of having a demonstration with large crowds of people. Okay, next slide. And on the other hand, we do see in parts of the world how far-right actors are enforcing far-right government policies around the coronavirus. And this is an area of research that I've conducted extensively upon. So in India, for example, the far-right has scapegoated Muslims as super spreaders, who they accuse of using the virus as a biopolitical tool as an act of Islamization of India. And I think this is also an interesting comparison to Yannick's survey results in the sense that we do see minority groups such as Muslims in India who are being scapegoated for the virus, but also here as a sort of a supposed biopolitical tool. And within online spaces in India, they're very quickly picked up this hashtag Corona Jihad, which became trending for, I think it was for several weeks actually, to show that the coronavirus was being used by the Muslim community as an act of jihad. And we can see here some images I've taken from 4chan and doing my research. So the image on the top right says a global Islamic terror organization is spreading corona worldwide. A couple of days ago, their India conspiracy was revealed and they were taken to hospital and they started spitting on doctors. This is the same organization which supplied the 9/11 hijacker to Al-Qaeda. They pretend to be a religious organization. So once again, spreading this narrative of Muslims being super spreaders of the virus. And then also with that image that you see there below it, again, using this narrative of Islamization, but also interestingly borrowing upon or the rhetorical parallels to the type of anti-Semitic tropes that we see concerning globalism. And indeed, during the pandemic, we also saw, for instance, members of a paramilitary group called the RSS, a far-right group, patrolling the streets and manning checkpoints to ensure that citizens were complying with the lockdown rules. In this sense, a paramilitary organization sort of took control over from the state in order to ensure policing of the public. Next slide, please. And then finally, I want to sort of bring out an example of a far right that is pro-vaccine. So what I've gathered here are images through my research looking at far-right women. In this case, these are far-right women in India, and we see them posting on Instagram actually getting their vaccination doses, which is quite different, I think, than the sort of examples that I had showed earlier with far-right women in North America. Now, why is there this sort of pro-vaccine, pro-science mentality amongst the Indian far-right? I quote here, India has embraced scientific epidemiology and followed global protocols often more vigorously than other nations. In addition to these protocols, the Indian government and Indian popular culture have enthusiastically promoted Vedic science as modern science. So they're very proud of their role in the world in terms of not only medical production, but also how that relates then to this broader narrative that ancient medicine is tied into modern medicine today. In particular, Mr. Modi and his cult of personality have played a significant role in mobilizing the nation while consolidating Hindu nationalism during the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, next slide. So just some concluding remarks here is the first is that COVID-19 has presented an opportunity for far-right extremists to merge with other ideologies and movements and means of spreading dis/misinformation. The second point, and really what's the overall argument of my presentation today, is that the narrative of far-right extremist responses to the pandemic is more complex and nuanced than that commonly presented, what we describe as the standard narrative. And then finally, far-right extremist responses are partially determined by relating to those who are in power. And I think this is often an overlooked element when we come to understanding those non-state actor relationships. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion later on.
Yeah, thank you, Evian. Like in our field, things are rarely straightforward. So thank you for adding some nuance to our thinking about the impact of COVID on the far right. And I appreciate your point about the coalescing of the various groups and causes. And I think it's if I can add a brief observation to that, a point that concerns me is that this is also happening with groups that are not in themselves far right, but that are, as a result of COVID, now in a coalition with the far right. So there's no longer a taboo towards working with groups that are far right. So I see like barriers becoming more porous in that regard, and taboos that appear to be wearing off. Okay, but so far we have talked a lot about the threat side of the matter, but there's also, of course, organizations out there that are trying to do something against violent non-state actors, and I think it'd be good to also take a look at how they've been doing. And for that, I know of a few better people to turn to than our next speaker, Leah West. Leah, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you very much. And I apologize to those for not being prompt. Delayed healthcare system. Gotta love socialized medicine. So thanks very much. I'm really excited to be here. Essentially, what I'm going to be doing today is just talking to you about some of the findings of myself and my co-editors and the researchers who contributed to the book you see on their screens, Stress Tested, the COVID-19 Pandemic and Canadian National Security. So the findings I'm referencing are specific to Canada, but I do suspect in consultation with both practitioners within Canada who have been speaking with their allies and how to respond, and also to speaking to individuals amongst the Five Eyes community, that their responses were rather similar, especially for countries like Australia, Canada, and the UK. So I'm going to just be focusing on three specific things over the course of my time. I want to focus first on the impact and response of the Canadian Armed Forces to their missions with respect to violent non-state actors. Second, the adaptation of the intelligence community, specifically CSIS and CSE. And then third, the failure of our criminal justice system and our criminal legal system to respond to an increase in extremism, partially because of everything else that was happening with COVID. So that's the last of my slides. What I'll say is, when the pandemic hit Canada in March of 2020, how ready the national security community was it had never been tested like this before. I think the thing that we try and do in our text is to not set an impossible standard. The pandemic was unique and unprecedented, and I don't think any government could be expected to be fully prepared. Nevertheless, we expect our security agencies to understand that the world is unpredictable, and it's appropriate to expect them to plan for a range of contingencies. So not surprisingly, when the pandemic struck, many of these agencies, unlike a lot of government departments, did have plans. They had business continuity plans that they were prepared to implement, but no good plan survives first contact. So they certainly didn't survive unscathed. So the plans were that we saw, whether we're talking about national defense or the intelligence community, the business continuity plans were really effective across the board at helping leaders decide what missions were a priority and what missions needed to be tasked. So missions like the growing rise of right-wing extremism, which we've heard continue to leverage the pandemic to its advantage, right? That remained a priority, as where other missions may have had reduced staffing to deal with them. But there were certain priorities that were certainly identified, and so staffing and attention and resources continued to be focused on those. In terms of the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces, they did have a detailed counter-pandemic contingency plan, which was Operation Laser. This was really important also for dealing with defense intelligence and making sure the defense intelligence community could continue to provide its advice and leverage its authorities to advance Canadian Forces missions. Importantly, on the concept of non-state actors, right, there was a few Canadian missions that were actually addressing that threat specifically. So these tended to be capacity building missions. So Operation Impact, which was the mission in Iraq to train soldiers to deal with the counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism activities there against Daesh and other movements in the region. And essentially, those missions had already been somewhat put on hold because you might recall, it seems a lifetime ago, there was a January 3, 2020 drone attack against Soleimani that ramped up the danger for coalition forces on the ground there. And so the mission had already kind of retracted, but when COVID happened, those capacity building missions were essentially folded up, right? There wasn't a capacity to keep Canadian forces that were in those capacity training missions safe when interacting with the local population and with local forces. And those missions, which were already coming up for renewal, which may have continued to be renewed but for the pandemic, ultimately got wrapped up. So we saw those missions just end. And there's been no discussion since of returning to assist Iraqi forces with their capacity in that region. So it did have a significant impact, at least on Canada's capacity to address that threat, that non-state threat in Iraq. There were also smaller missions that do continue. So we did have peacekeeping missions and a NATO mission in Kosovo, and a small mission in Congo. These smaller missions were largely unaffected simply because it was less capacity building and more headquarter type jobs that were supporting the broader missions there. So they've continued. We also have 10 members in South Sudan supporting a UN mission. Those have also continued. But it really was that capacity building mission in Iraq that ultimately just got wiped out by the pandemic. So what about the intelligence community? Obviously, the community had to revise its expectations of what it could and could not do for a variety of reasons. When you're an intelligence agency, you rely on human sources, you rely on technical sources, you rely on covert meetings. When people stop flying in and out of the country, when people stop leaving their homes, it becomes more challenging to arrange those human source handler interactions, right? It's harder to surveil people when nobody leaves their home. So all of this did have an impact on how the intelligence community responded to its typical operations when trying to counter, for example, the threat of extremism within Canada. So it had to adapt. Obviously, a reliance on technical means became just as the bad guys were leveraging technical sources, so too did our intelligence community have to leverage technical sources more frequently in order to gain an understanding of what was really going on in that threat group. So obviously it had an impact on the amount of intelligence and also had an impact on what kind of intelligence the intelligence community was relying on. One of the trends that we saw really grow here was an increased reliance on open source information throughout the pandemic and the creation of new open source briefing materials for the client, because it wasn't just the intelligence community who had staff that were now working from home and not able to access classified materials or communicate openly in a classified setting, right, which you would if you were in the office. The customer, the clients requiring that information to make decisions also weren't able to get classified information because they too were working at home. So encountering the threat, thinking about the threat, deciding on actions, there became an increased reliance on open source information that could be leveraged in an unclassified way and provide the provision of unclassified materials to decision makers. So that was something that we saw and a trend that we suspect will continue to see. The other big thing in the intelligence community that we saw was an increased connection and growing relationships with non-traditional partners. And again, this comes from the growth of non-traditional threats, right? All of a sudden, universities, healthcare sectors, hospitals became major targets, not just for states who are seeking to leverage the technology, but for criminal activity, right? So the ransomware attacks against the healthcare sector and became a huge concern. So we had intelligence agencies really reaching out with these new partners to inform and build relationships to understand the threat environment, to build safety and security. So the Canadian Cyber Centre did a huge push there. And we also saw CSIS do over 400 outreach meetings with university and researchers who were, whose not just technology was seeking to be stolen, but also to be leveraged for ransomware attacks, for example. So those are two big trends in the intelligence community. The third one, core actor when we're talking about violent non-state actors is law enforcement. Law enforcement and the criminal justice system were really, really tested here. And that's actually where we got the term here, was because we saw our justice system seriously stress tested during the pandemic. As a whole, the criminal justice system was stress tested. because of an increase in certain types of criminal behaviors, such as cyber scams and frauds, as well as the introduction of new healthcare regulations that needed to be enforced. Then you had investigators and prosecutors who confronted with new enforcement obligations, along with new distinct types of criminality, which created new and unforeseen challenges and increased the need for different types of professional expertise in the field. We also, as we know from this presentation, really did see an increase in ideologically motivated extremism, and particularly on the far right, conspiracy-driven threats like QAnon. And that trend directly implicated Canada's national security apparatus, especially its enforcement ranks like the RCMP, as well as local and provincial police and prosecution services who do not have experience or expertise with dealing with ideologically motivated violence or threats. This layered on top of a criminal justice system that was already showing signs of being stretched to its capacity. So our criminal and law enforcement systems were already stretched in terms of their use of modern technology. Canadian courts and the criminal justice system found their capacity really limited during the pandemic, forcing them to make decisions about priorities and the use of techniques on the fly. So realistically, whether or not the criminal justice system and law enforcement prosecution, because of how stretched and how broken the system became during all of this, the criminal justice system really served no deterrent to extremism in Canada and the growing threat of ideologically motivated threat actors. There was just there was a lack of understanding of those who were forced to deal with the threat. Those who do have that capacity, the RCMP, were stretched thin. And then the criminal justice system, in terms of actually bringing charges and being able to prosecute them so there'd be any form of deterrence whatsoever, was just totally broken. So, in terms of, the failure here, it was at that criminal and law enforcement level to deal with violent non-state actors. So there is maybe one shining spot when we're talking about law enforcement, and that came from Canada Border Services Agency. Obviously, when borders are closed, there is less of a risk of violent non-state actors moving into Canada. But conversely, Canada was not deporting people either, right? Because there were serious humanitarian concerns about deporting people back to areas that may not have been able to manage the pandemic. And so there were basically deportations got put on hold. And deportations is actually where we see, violent non-state actors, so would-be terrorists or former terrorists who are in Canada. It's usually through the deportation system and not through the criminal justice system that we manage that threat. And so deportations just essentially came all the way to a grounding halt. However, CBSA used the time that it had to clear its books of administrative deportations, which essentially is they were able to track down people who had actually already left and closed their files. So that meant that once the borders reopened and deportations resumed, they'd be in a better position to facilitate quickly deportations of people who were found inadmissible, for example, their participation in war crimes or for terrorist activity. So that's the one bright spot when it comes to enforcement. So overall, it was certainly a mixed bag. In terms of dealing with the foreign terrorist threat, Canada's mission has essentially ground to a halt there as a result of the pandemic. In terms of the intelligence community, they did respond, they prioritized certain missions, and they've adapted in ways that will probably serve them better into the future. We saw significant cracks in the criminal justice system that seriously need to be addressed. And we see a Border Services Agency ready to deal with deportation of violent or threatening actors in Canada for when we resume deportations. So that's kind of the broader landscape of how we responded in Canada. It may be different in different countries, but I suspect that a lot of the adaptations and challenges were similar across similarly situated countries. That's it.
Thank you so much, Leah, for offering us like a view into an organization or several organizations really that had to do a lot of adapting. I got to say there have been times during the last year and a half that have been that I felt very, very fortunate and relieved that I wasn't working in government. Just like imagine having to deal with this this kind of thing. Thank you. We don't have a lot of time left. We do have some questions that came in during the session. Let's see. I have an interesting one here, and I'm not quite sure who is the best person to address the question to. So I'm just going to read it, and we'll see whether there are any takers for this one. I think because you talked a lot about the far right, and someone asked whether it is fair to say that the far right has been better or more successful at leveraging COVID-19 to its advantage than the jihadists have been. Anyone with an idea about that?
Perhaps I can start and others might want to join in. I mean, based upon what I've presented today, we certainly see how the far right is exploiting the pandemic in ways to advance its agenda, perhaps, yes, more effectively than jihadists have. And part of that is due to their success or perhaps the strategy of, for lack of a better term, piggybacking on other sorts of, let's say, conspiratorial groups or anti-government groups or militia groups, and sort of taking advantage of the situation in order to insert its ideology and goals amongst with these other networks. Perhaps there's others on the panel that disagree with me or not, or I'm very curious to know actually if Yannick, if you had asked this within the survey.
Yeah,
so Yannick, you want to jump in, please?
I can't speak with authority about whether that is the case, but I can speak to what the 142 people that we surveyed. It really does seem like both organizations have, or both sets of ideological social movements have leveraged a pandemic in very different fashion. When it comes to the social media stuff or the online propaganda, it does seem that the far right is kind of the winner there in their campaign. When it comes to capability building, it seems that jihadist groups are believed to have made progress in kind of solidifying their place on the ground and doing these pro-social activities in essentially eating at the role of the state and then recruiting more individuals in doing so. So again, this is not something that we empirically tested, but this is what the majority of people that we surveyed seem to tell us. But there's a lot more place for empirical research on these topics.
Yeah, no, it's obviously. I think it's going to take some time for us to really like assess the effect of that this whole thing has had on violent non-state actors, and I think that's a nice bridge to another question that came up, and that I think I could direct at Barbara and or David, and that has to do with like how lasting these effects will be. So we talked about how the people went down the rabbit hole and developed and adopted all kinds of ideas that you could consider problematic. What's your sense as to whether those ideas will stay with those people once we get out of COVID? Is there let's say lasting damage, or will it maybe go away when COVID goes away? Barbara or David?
Maybe I can go first, David. I don't think we are in a position to say for certain how like long the effects or lasting the effects are going to be, but I do think that they might lose some legitimacy once we're out of COVID, because at this point it's, as Evie had pointed out, it's relatively easy for the far right to pick on arguments that have, or narratives that have become almost mainstream, like for example in the case of COVID-19, there's a lot on these groups talking a lot of talk about globalization and the fact that COVID-19 has, was supposed to be originally a matter of one state, and then because of globalization, now we are all affected by it, and this has brought, instability, a crisis, etc. And by attacking globalization, then they're able to easily bring up the issue of ethno-nationalism. And so this is something that right now a lot of people would maybe be interested in learning more about in the context of COVID-19, just because of a sense of frustration, increasing anxiety, increasing isolation, more exposure to alternative narratives online. So I do think that maybe the impact is not going to be as big as it is right now, where there's a new sort of audiences listening to these narratives that maybe in a context where there's no crisis, people would be a little bit more wary to follow. So that's what I would say. It's a little bit more optimistic than usually we tend to say.
To add to this, I'm gonna do one of I'm gonna break one of the cardinal rules of scholarship here and share a gut opinion, I suppose. And I do have to say that this needs to be empirically tested. And Barbara's right, we're not really in a position to say anything here with absolute authority. But I'm gonna put my neck out there and say, well, one, we're not going to see, COVID's not ending anytime soon, but in terms of COVID as a source of right-wing extremism, I think it's a flash in the pan. And I'm saying this because as someone who's looked at the far right over in depth at a high level over the last 6 to 7 years and more, what I've been noticing amongst some of the actors I've been following, what I've been noticing across various research projects and research initiatives is that I'll tracing the life course of one of the typical people I've been following. I started talking to some of them in 2015, and their ideas were leftist, anti-government, freemen on the land, and so on and so forth. And then when Trump gets elected, suddenly we see the shift to the far right. And then when this whole talk about immigration and make America first and so on and so forth, there's another, it's a more subtle shift, but there's another shift to the cause du jour, whatever anti-authoritarian cause is at the forefront of the far right's animus or focus. And then with the switch to COVID, it's now taken over. We see the blending of anti-vax and other ideas from the right-wing idea sphere. And I suspect, again, COVID's not going anywhere anytime soon, but in the long term, there's going to be another point of outrage that I think it's more about the actors and less about the focus. It's more about the ideology than the actual cause. And I'm seeing the nodding heads. Maybe this isn't as controversial as I thought. I'd be interested to hear what my colleagues or the audience have to say. But this is honestly something I want to work out more. This is my gut feeling from that's been developing over the last year and a half.
Thank you for sharing your gut instinct with us. We won't quote you on it, but I do need to point out that this is being recorded, so you are on a record. But I will say that a lot of what you said, man, it's makes sense. I mean, I think that when something like this happens, like we immediately tend to think the worst of it and then start thinking in worst case scenarios. But maybe it will be that flash in the pan. But then this is I guess another sort of nice bridge to a question that came up, and that has to do with our ability as scholars to actually make projections along those lines. So Yannick, there's someone in our audience who is wondering whether you can give your assessments, like sort of based on the answers to the surveys compared to the reality as it has played out. Whether you can give your assessment of how good we as terrorism researchers actually are at estimating the effects of something like COVID. I know you've been grading a lot of papers recently, so can I maybe invite you to step back into that grading mindset and tell our audience how well we terrorism researchers have done on this?
So this isn't me trying to dodge the question as much as I had noticed that Leah had her hand up on the previous topic, and I'd like to just pass the baton back to Leah, because I'd really like to hear about her. At the end of the day, the short answer is we don't know, and we're not going to know for a very long period of time whether those predictions are worth anything. But I want to hear from the person who's actually done this research. So if that's all right, too, and I'm gonna duck that question.
Sure.
So I reading obviously the scholarly work of Amar and others in our textbook and talking to analysts, I think the expectation from those who seek to understand and counter the threat is that the idea is that the techniques and tools developed and the language and communication skills developed over COVID-19 will continue to be leveraged, whichever that messaging is, right? As David said, it'll be something else, but we saw new skill sets grow. And the other thing that we also saw was a growth in distrust in government amongst the general population and anger towards the government with respect to lockdowns, enforced vaccinations. So people that would never necessarily go and read the things being written by some of these groups, right, are being funneled towards that because of the measures being taken, the extreme and emergency measures being taken. It's built a distrust in maybe segments of the population that didn't exist before, and those fissures could be leveraged, again, by these movements moving forward. So long-term effects may not be, as David said, I tend to agree with David, but I do think that tools, techniques, and then the amount of population that might be susceptible has grown through COVID.
That's a more nuanced answer, I think, than what I gave. So I agree. It's while I was being flippant, my colleague's absolutely right. It's an evolutionary movement too, and we absolutely have to pay attention to those tools. So, thank you.
Yeah, it reminds me of that Zhu Enlai quote when they asked him in 1972 or something what the impact of the French Revolution was. He said, "Well, it's too early to tell." Well, and the truth behind that story is that he thought he was being asked about the protest movement from '68. So that it's not really some piece of Chinese wisdom that he was sharing, but I do think that it's in an ironic way appropriate for what we've been discussing today, because when something major like this pandemic happens, then it's tempting to believe that its impact on a lot of things will also be major, but I think that the panelists are right in pointing out that remains to be seen. And I think on that note, I'm going to say thank you to all of our panelists. I'm going to thank our audience for attending, for asking questions, for engaging with us. When you leave this live briefing, you will see a quick survey that you can fill out to help us improve future live briefings. So please do feel free to fill that out. And yeah, I think that this is a topic that is going to keep us off the streets for a while. So maybe we'll see each other again to see where we stand. Thank you all. And on that note, I'm adjourning the live briefing. Thank you very much, everyone.